Welcome back to stage 3 of the Mirage GT build video series. In this video, we're going to be completing our panel fitting. This includes fitting the bonnet and catches, fitting the side doors, and fitting the boot and locking system. As usual, a full list of the torque settings for this video can be found on our website using the link in the description below. With our wing rails and wheel arches now successfully installed on our chassis, we're now going to continue with our build by completing our panel fitting. We're going to start by fitting our bonnet. First up are our two bonnet hinges. We're going to install these slightly loosely for now, as we may need to marginally adjust their positioning once we've moved the bonnet into its optimum position. With both bonnet hinges now in place, we can now move the bonnet into position onto the body and allow each of the 4 bonnet studs to drop through into position on the bonnet hinges. We can now secure these in place using the bolts and washers provided. With our bonnet now attached to its hinges, it's advisable to check the fitment here to ensure that the bonnet is opening and closing without any alignment issues. The position of the bonnet and hinges can be adjusted horizontally and vertically by adjusting the bolts and hinges accordingly. However, this process will be perfected at a later stage of our build, prior to final body preparation and painting. We're now ready to fit the bonnet striker plates and bonnet stay. First up are the bonnet striker plates, which are positioned facing outwards and secured in place using the washers and nylocks provided. We can now also use the same procedure to attach the bonnet stay bracket, which will be fitted facing inwards. With the stay bracket now in position, we can now attach our bonnet stay and loosely secure this in place for now. It's now time to fit the bottom of the bonnet stay to the inner wing panel. We're going to start by attaching a strip of masking tape along the inner right side of the body, and by closing the bonnet, we're going to mark the position of the top bonnet stay bolt as it falls into its closed position. We can now also make another mark 300mm further down the body, which will serve as the location of the bottom of the stay bracket. At this second mark point, we can now attach an additional strip of masking tape vertically downwards on the inside of the engine bay panel, and with our bonnet stay set in its locked position, we can now mark the position of the bottom bonnet stay bracket, like so. We can now drill these holes and secure the bottom bonnet stay bracket in position, using the bolts, washers and nylocks provided. Next up are the bonnet catches and release cable. We start by attaching 2 bolts and nylocks to our bonnet catches. Once secure, we can now add 2 hex nuts and detach the brackets, followed by 2 single washers and nylocks. Moving on to the release cable now, we're going to start by removing the locking nut and washer and sliding the cable through its bracket before once again securing the locking nut and washer. We can now attach the release cable bracket to the steering column bracket. With the bracket now secure, we're now going to drill a hole in the top right hand corner of our bulkhead and feed the release cable through into the engine bay. With the release cable now fed through, we're going to take our right hand bonnet catch and hold it in position on our chassis before marking the position of the cable against the first bolt hole of our bonnet catch. As this will be the point where the release cable passes through the bonnet catch bolt, we're going to cut and temporarily remove the outer casing of the release cable at this point. It's important to only cut the outer casing and not the inner cable at this marked point, as we will need the inner cable's full length to connect up the second of our 2 bonnet catches on the left hand side of the chassis. With our outer casing now successfully removed, we can now attach the first of our pre-drilled bolts to our bonnet catch and feed the release cable through the bonnet catch. Once the release cable has been successfully fed through the bonnet catch, we can now attach the bonnet catch and bracket to the wing rail. We can now also connect our left-hand bonnet catch and bracket along with the second of our pre-drilled bolts. Next, we're going to cut a 2-inch section of the discarded outer casing and slide it back along the release cable. This will be secured in place using a P-clip at a later stage of this video. We can now feed the release cable through the second of our pre-drilled bolts, and once we've found the optimum position, we can tighten our pre-drill bolt to secure the release cable tightly in place. With both of our bonnet catches now successfully fitted and connected up to our release cable, we now need to test the tension of the release cable. We can do this by pressing both of the bonnet catches down into their locked position and then pulling the handle of our release cable to reopen the bonnet catches. It's vitally important not to close the bonnet itself at this stage until we've conducted multiple tests of the release cable and ensured that it's opening both of the bonnet catches correctly at every attempt. Once we've confirmed that the release cable is working successfully, We can now fine-tune the position of the bonnet catches against the bonnet striker plates by gently lowering the bonnet down into its closed position and fine-tuning the position of the bonnet catch bolts until the striker plates are fitting securely into the bonnet catches. Next up, we're going to fit our scuttle bracket. The bottom end of this bracket will be attached to the central riv nut of our chassis. To secure the top of the bracket, we'll need to mark the position of the bracket against the fiberglass body and drill a 5mm hole before securing the bracket in place, like so. With our scuttle bracket now securely in position, we can now attach our P-clip and move the loose 2-inch section of outer casing on our bonnet release cable into position against the bracket. This will ensure that the bonnet release cable is held neatly and securely in position inside the engine bay. The final stage of fitting our bonnet is to fit our front body support. We're going to add a small amount of bonding adhesive to this front body support and move it into a central position on the front of our chassis. It may be useful at this stage to attach a pair of G-clamps to the bottom of the body support here, whilst the bonding adhesive sets. As with the scuttle bracket, we now need to mark, drill and countersink an additional 5mm hole into the fiberglass body. We can now secure the body support using the bolts provided and fine-tune the final position of the body support as deemed necessary. With all of the bonnet components now successfully installed on our chassis, we're now going to move on to fitting our 2 side doors. Each of our doors comes pre-fitted with its handles, door cappings, door stay and hinges. We're going to start by temporarily removing the door stay. Notice how the holes of each inner hinge plate are slightly off center. We need to position these inner hinge plates with the holes slightly off center, facing towards the rear of the chassis, like so. We can now move our inner hinge plates into position behind the door pillar and secure it in place with the 2 rose joints, like so. With the inner hinge plate and rose joints now in place, we can now attach the door by moving the door pins into position on top of our 2 rose joints. It's important at this stage to fine-tune the position of each of our rose joints to ensure that the door is positioned as evenly as possible against the chassis. However, this process will be perfected at a later stage of our build. Once we're relatively happy with the position of the door on its rose joints, we can now mark the position of the door stay onto the chassis. We can now hold the door stay against the chassis with the pivot pin positioned in the center of our newly marked square, before marking and drilling a 6mm bolt hole which will be used to attach our door stay to the chassis. We're now ready to reattach the door stay to our door and connect it up to the chassis using the bolt and washer provided. Next up is our door striker plate. We're going to start by moving the striker plate into position from behind the body. We can now add our gasket and stainless steel finisher before loosely securing the striker plate in place with the 2 bolts provided. Notice how the striker plate holes on the body allow for adjustment. It's important that we refrain from fully tightening up the striker plate at this point, as we may need to adjust its positioning in order to align it correctly with our door catches. Once we're happy with the position of the striker plate, we can now secure it tightly in place. This process can now be repeated in full for the second door on the passenger side of our chassis. For the final stage of our panel fitting, we're going to be installing the rear boot and locking system. We start by fitting the boot hinges. These will be positioned facing inwards, and notice how the majority of the washers for each boot hinge are positioned on the left of the hinge brackets. With our boot hinges now fitted to their brackets, we can now move the boot cover into position and secure it to the hinges using the bolts provided. As with the previous panel fittings, we may require several attempts at adjusting the position of the boot cover here. However, this fitment will be perfected at a later stage of our build. With our boot cover now successfully fitted, we can now fit the locking system, which consists of our central locking kit, boot striker and boot lock. First up is our boot striker. This will be fitted on the underside of the boot cover facing outwards. With our boot striker now in place, we can now lower the boot cover and mark the position of the striker against the rear of our fiberglass body. This marked position will help us align the position for the boot catch of our central locking kit. We're going to add a strip of masking tape along the bottom of our fiberglass body and align our central locking kit against the body, with the channel of our boot catch resting in line with our marked position. This will allow us to mark and drill a further 2 6mm holes, which will be used to secure the bracket of our central locking kit, like so. We can now temporarily secure this bracket using 2 bolts and penny washers from underneath the body, before adding a further 2 washers and nylocks from above, like so. As per the procedure for fitting the bonnet catches, it's important not to close the boot at this stage until we have successfully fitted and tested our boot release cable. Once we're happy with the position of the base of our boot catch, we can now mark the position of its top bracket against the inside of the body, before temporarily removing the central locking kit completely and drilling an additional 5mm hole, like so. We're now ready to fit the boot lock. We start by adding a strip of masking tape over our newly drilled 5mm hole. We now need to accurately measure the relative positions of the additional bolt and barrel of our boot lock, and mark these positions on the masking tape accordingly before drilling through the body, which will allow us to move the boot lock into its final position. Once these additional holes have been drilled and filed, we can now move the boot lock into position. We're going to add a nylock and washer to the right hand bolt of our boot lock. And for the left hand bolt, we're going to add a single hex nut, which will act as a spacer between the boot lock and the bracket of our central locking kit. Our central locking kit can now be moved into position against the boot lock and secured in place with an additional washer and nylock. With the boot lock now secure, we can now attach our opening lever and once again secure the bolts at the base of our central locking kit to a nice tight fit. We will connect up the central locking kit solenoid at a later stage of our build, once the car has been painted and trimmed. With our bonnet, side doors and boot now successfully fitted on our chassis, we can now move on to the next video.